to this week's academic seminar at HKUST Institute for Emerging Market Studies. Very happy to welcome Danqing Wang from University of Hong Kong. Danqing is a graduate of HKUST, did her MPhil in social science, worked with Xiaogang, I believe. Yeah. That's why it was so important for him to be here. But Danqing is now doing a lot of interesting work in emerging markets, not just China, but Brazil and investments in Africa. And so we're very happy to have her present some of her recent research.
So I prefer not to use the mic because I think my voice is loud enough. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation, and also thank you very much for the introduction. I'm Danqing Wang. I'm currently an assistant professor in the University of Hong Kong. So it's really exciting to be back here and to present after almost 6 years since I defended my MPhil thesis. And it's my great pleasure to share my academic progress in front of my former advisor and instructors who have guided me to the academic world. So before going to the topic today, I would like to share with you some of my research background and my research taste, where I come from to this research. So some of you probably have known that I studied here with Professor Xiaogang on sociology, especially on social stratification and education attainment during the transitional era. So those 2 years of training here have greatly shaped my research trajectory later on in business school. Although currently I do not study individual outcome, however, the theoretical approach remains largely the same. So in comparison with my colleagues in business schools who are most interested in studying firms' resources, capabilities from a market efficiency perspective, I'm more interested in a structural explanation on firms' outcomes. So to be more specific, I'm more interested in to see to what extent the macro environments, social, political, and cultural environments play a big role in shaping firms' various strategies, such as diversification, corporate social responsibility, FDI, etc., especially in the transitional era. So China ideally is one of my most important research contexts. And as Professor Park has mentioned, China is only one of my research contexts, and I have other research in Brazil and Mozambique. They are all emerging markets. So it's really an interesting perspective to compare what are the differences and similarities that are shared among those emerging markets. So this is where I come from, and today's topic is one of such attempts to study how the political environments may impact firms' diversification strategy. And to be more specific, I study the political incentives of government officials, how their political incentives may play a role in deciding firms' diversification strategy, which has been studied a lot, diversification strategy through an economic perspective. So I would like to see it through a different picture. Okay. So in the role, all the nation states primarily concerns about two basic goals: economic growth and social stability. In the past several decades, almost all the emerging markets have adopted a pro-market agenda. They liberalize their economy, they open their doors to the outside world, and they attract FDI. However, this neoliberalism reform is not always a smooth sailing, sorry. So the labor adjustment has always created problems for the government and for the government officials. So imagine when there are lots of people who are shaken off from the ineffective public sectors, or there are young people who are unable to find a job, what do? Normally they would protest or they would demonstrate on the street in front of the government official's office, and that creates a lot of problems for social stability. So social stability, among the others, also becomes the baseline for the government in order to maintain the harmonious society in the Chinese term. So how to address adjustment of laid off or displaced workers is another important issue for the government officials. Like Professor Park has this huge project on employment, right? So that's his concern for many public policy makers and economists and sociologists. So here is a story, very interesting story. Anyone from Europe here? Which country are you from? France, good. So we know, I lived in France for 4 years. So this is your president.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you heard of the story before.
Which one?
Yeah. So Unilever, this was a story before along the presidential election in 2012, I think. So Unilever would like to close a factory called Calais, which is a tea maker factory in southern France that employed almost 800 people. Of course, because of the closing decision, all the workers from that factory got really angry. So they protested, they demonstrated on the street, as French people really like to do, right? And that was really a sensitive period. That was before the presidential election. And that region was a major region for the Socialist Party. So that event caught lots of attention from the media. And that was really looked back for the Socialist Party, especially for President Hollande. So he sent the affiliate, the labor union, to do a negotiation with Unilever, and told the workers saying, okay, we are not closing the factory, at least for now. So please go home and do not protest during the sensitive period. So the workers bought his word and got quiet. What happened next? Only 15 days after the election, after Hollande became the president, the factory was closed. So that was a really bad story, and those workers really hate Hollande for this reason. What happens if such things happened in China? So this story is pretty familiar with many of you. So we know that during the economic reform era, there are so many bankrupted state-owned firms, right? Because of inefficiency, because net loss for many times. So how do Chinese local government officials deal with the closure of a factory, and how do they address the issues for laid-off workers? Here is an example. So the company, Shaodong Gear Company, it is a classic state-owned company, founded in 1996. Debt ratio really high and has net loss for several years. So apparently it went bankruptcy in 1997 and laid off more than 1,000 people, which create lots of problems for the local region. So what did Guangdong government officials do? So they went to another local company called Shaonan Group, which is also state-controlled, and it was publicly listed in 1996. However, it was not operating in the gear industry. It was operating in the hydroelectricity industry. But it is a well-performing company. So the local government officials went to the company saying, hey, could you please acquire the bankrupted firms, especially to take over all the laid-off workers. So they did so. The publicly listed group acquired the company in 1998, and as a result, it diversified into the industry of gear production, which we call, in the economic term, we call unrelated diversification, as a result of the government officials' request upon acquiring the bankrupted state-owned firms. So this is the background of this study. So what are the common running through the two examples? That is well summarized in The Economist. So there is one sentence saying, state capitalism introduces commercial criteria into political decisions and political decisions into commercial ones. So we see how the incentives of along the presidential election interferes into the economic decision of factory closure, and how the government officials' request of the publicly listed firms interfered its acquisition decision. So the research question that I'm asking is, when the government has its own social and political stability goals, how do firms, the economic actors, get drawn into accommodating such social and political goals? This is a big question that I'm asking through all my research projects, not even in China, but also in other contexts. In this paper specifically, I'm asking, since the state is not monolistic, how do government officials' career concerns influence how and when they solicit enterprises accommodation? So the focus here is government officials and how, under what conditions they are more likely to influence local firms to do such things. So definitely I'm not the first one to study the role of state or the role of government officials. In business school or in organization theories, the primary perspective that looks at the role of the state is called institutional theories. So no matter it is from the economic version of the institutional theory, North institutions, or the sociological version of institutional theory, they both study the state as a provider of regulations, laws, or rules that can regulate economic exchange. However, in this kind of literature, they really theorize the inside process of the state by saying that the state in their analysis is taken as a given or as a background against which firms' behaviors and strategies are playing out, while the state itself seldom enters the central analysis. So they seldom examine the role of the agency. So that's the blank in this big literature. However, in another stream of literature, in another discipline called political sociology or political science, the state definitely is their focal analysis. So for example, in developmental states, there are many sociologists and political scientists would like to study to what extent the role of the state and the bureaucracy, the merit-based bureaucracy, can explain the success of countries like Japan, South Korea, or Singapore. So for them, they really put the role of the state and the role of the bureaucracies into the central analysis. However, for them, because they are sociologists and political scientists, they are more interested at the macro level economic and social outcomes, such as societal level GDP growth or societal level other measurements. Field research looks at firm level consequences. So what I'm trying to do is to draw on the insights from political sociology and political science by looking at the consequences at the firms, to fill in the void or to fill in the gaps in the organization theories. So I try to draw two literatures together and by filling the gaps. So the framework I set for today's research is, okay, we know now the states or the government has the social and the political goals, say maintaining social stability. And because the state is not a standalone entity, the state has always to tap into outside resources to help them to achieve various goals. So normally firms, the economic actors, are the most important economic entities in the society, so the state normally approach and engage firms in that kind of process. What I'm interested in is the process of heterogeneity. So I would like to explain the variances and what conditions that the state would approach and engage firms to achieve its social and political goals. And I explain the heterogeneity through two sets of theoretical concepts or theoretical perspectives. The first one I'm highlighting here is the government officials' political incentives. I will explain more later on. And then the other one is to what extent the bureaucracy or the government can routinely interact with enterprises. And that interaction can also have an impact on firms' strategy. So the context of the study, I have mentioned a little bit in the story. So it's a state-owned firms reform in China, which we are all, I believe, which we are all familiar with. So in 1997, the central government set up a big agenda for reforming state-owned firms, which are ineffective and inefficient. So the strategy called 抓大放小, which means they would only pour resources to those giant and big enterprises, but let medium and small-sized enterprises go bankrupt. based on the market efficiency principle. So the consequences is that lots of state-owned firms went bankruptcy across China, and a lot of laid-off workers were generated. So for those workers, they used to be employed by the state sector, so they thought they were holding the iron ball forever. Suddenly, they were out of job, and they lost their living means forever. So many of them wouldn't believe it, and they went on the street to protest, like what French people would do on China. And of course, the media would never report on that kind of incidences. So those kind of laid-off workers, they create lots of problems and concerns for social unrest that would threaten the local stability for the government officials. So the government officials, in order to maintain the goal for social stability, they have to find a ways to address that. So asking the most efficient and convenient way that is employed by all the government officials across China was the way that I described earlier on. That is, normally they would ask another local firms to acquire the bankrupt state-owned firms and take over the laid-off workers as one package. This is the most efficient way for them to do so. So any questions here? Not clear regarding the background? So when I did the presentation in front of Western audience, lots of especially in America, then I have to go through a long process in order to explain the rationale underlying that. They would never understand why firms would like to do so and what the rationale regarding the government officials. But I think in front of you, that's a pretty straightforward story here. It's a good thing. So you have
you mean for firms to take on these laid-off workers from other firms?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they would acquire the bankrupt firms and take over all the laid-off workers in one package.
Right. I mean, it doesn't seem like that really. How widespread was that, though? I mean, I thought a lot of people were just laid off, and the government did also provide a pretty generous subsidy package, right, for laid-off workers.
Yeah, so they have many measurements. They have many means to do that. So for the laid-off workers, they stay on the payroll of the bankrupt state-owned firm for 3 years. They can still get salaries for 3 years. But after that, you are free. And another thing is, many government officials would like to do so, ask another local firms to acquire, but the problem is, it's sometimes difficult to find such local firms. And many local firms say no to such requests. But we do observe lots of incidences like that, especially for private firms. So private firms, especially small, medium-sized private firms, they do such things as a favor to the government, and in return they get other benefits from the government, like land and bank loans, in order to do such things. So there is economic rationale underlying this kind of irrational deal.
But they must be trading that off with other considerations. I mean, number one, they probably don't have to keep all the workers.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone was laying off workers at this time, I think.
They would take partial of
some of the workers.
Yeah, some of the workers they would shift, but at least from the deal, it was negotiated through the deal at the beginning.
But maybe they were getting a good deal. If they're buying a firm, if the price is sufficiently cheap,
that could be.
They might be willing to do it purely for business reasons.
Yeah, that could be.
For,
Definitely. Yeah. That's why I also come to rule out these alternative explanations. I control all the economic explanations as well. Yeah, that's for sure, definitely. So another example which may provide an interesting insight into the process of story. So there is a small firm called Little Big Tool Company. It is a private firm, and on the company website, it has this kind of sentences. So for those who do not read Chinese, do not worry. You can only pay attention to the numbers. So what does this paragraph mean? It says we acquired bankrupt state-owned firms or in unrelated industries in 4 times, in 1999, 2003, twice, and then 2005. So we absorbed 285 laid-off workers. And the last sentence is really interesting. It says, so we effectively, by doing that, we effectively sustained the stable development of Danqing County, where the company is located, and relieved the unemployment pressure for the government. So they explicitly expressed this kind of a deal as to do the favor for the government. So you can, if you search many private companies, they regard this kind of a deal as corporate social responsibility. They're saying, I'm doing the good deal for the government and I maintain social stability in the concern of the government. So now let's move to the hypothesis. And all my hypotheses are trying to explain under what conditions this type of story is most likely to happen. And I explain it first through government officials' political incentive. So we know that China has featured a big and complicated bureaucracy since many years. And this bureaucracy is really effective in terms of absorbing the most talented people from the society. And it is a merit-based bureaucracy, which means after they are screening, after they get admission into the bureaucracy, they are further evaluated and promoted based on their performance in driving driving social development, such as economic growth. And it is the long-term career path that can structure their incentives. So because the evaluation and the promotion based on performance, and in the literatures we know that career incentives determine individuals' attention and resource allocation. It's like us, we are researchers, we are university faculty. If our tenure package is hinging on research and teaching, so we'll do research and teaching crazily. So for government officials, it is the similar thing. When they are evaluated based on certain goals, they would prioritize on that goals. And so goals coupled with career concerns would be prioritized for almost everybody. So here is an interesting trade-off in China. We know that GDP growth, there are lots of empirical evidence has been set forth that GDP growth is no matter in comparison with their peer provinces or in comparison with their historical record, GDP growth is one of the most important promotion criteria for local government officials. However, there's another set of criteria called social stability. In Chinese, we call 维稳, right? So maintain social stability as a baseline performance criteria for local officials. So how do they make a balance between the two, or how do they prioritize between the two, and under what conditions? So I'm arguing that because the GDP growth decides promotion, so those promotable officials, or in other terms, relatively younger officials who still have a relatively long horizon until their retirement, because they are striving for rewards from the system, they are still striving for promotion. So they would, relatively speaking, they would prioritize their attention and resources on the goal of GDP growth. So what do they do normally? They attract huge investments, they do big projects, they do not concern over environmental protection or government of welfare, but put everything on driving GDP growth. However, for another set of government officials, because social stability is the baseline for almost every government officials, and especially true for those retiring officials, which means they do not have any political prospect in this system, and what they concern most is a smooth transition from current position to retirement. They would like to get, for example, they would like to get a seat in People's Congress or People's Consultative Congress and still remain their influences in the political system. So what they are comparing with those promotable officials, for those retiring officials, what they want most is to avoid any punishment from the society, from the system. So any social breakout happening in their region and during their last years would really bad signal for their career. So what they are trying, because they do not have more years to strive for promotion to further levels, maintaining nothing bad happening in their region is the most concern for them. So I'm arguing here, comparing promotable officials and retiring officials. Retiring officials relatively prioritize on the goal of social stability, and promotable officials relatively put more focus on GDP growth. So this is an important. So theoretically, I'm arguing in this way, and this is also an empirical. People would also find the control argument, but empirically, I found my argument is true. The empirical evidence is aligned with my argument. So, under my context, what I'm arguing is that when there are regional firms, when there are lots of laid-off workers because of bankrupt state-owned firms, and regional firms are required or are approached to acquire bankrupt firms. And as a result, acquiring firms, because after acquiring such industries, acquire such unrelated bankrupt state-owned firms, they enter new industries as a result. And this story is more likely to happen when the province is governed by a retiring official, because the retiring officials are relatively prioritized on such issue. So the hypothesis is interaction effect. When the number of laid-off workers increase in that province, and also when the province has retiring officials, we would observe, as a result, we would observe firms in that region would enter more new industries as a result. So this is how the retiring officials' incentives would have an impact on firms' diversification strategy. So the story I'm arguing here is a political incentive story, and I fully understand that the hypothesis is not that straightforward, because I'm not measuring acquisition per se, but another step further entering into new industries. And we do not know whether it's really the incentive story is happening here, or it's other just purely efficiency story. So I have another two boundary conditions, two additional hypotheses in order to provide more evidence on the political incentive story. So we know that timing is really important for political officials. It's like timing decides the election, and there are lots of empirical research on when election approach, the politicians would do such short-run things in order to win election. I think for people who are from democratic countries, you would see that kind of behaviors a lot, right? So it's also true for Chinese officials. So when there is a party's congress, so normally the promotion news would be announced in the party's congress, and 1 year later. So during that political sensitive period, any social breakout would hurt officials' records. So in other words, when there is a party's congress coming, everybody, no matter it is retiring officials or promotable officials, they would prioritize the goal of social stability. So the distinction that we observed in previous hypotheses would disappear. That is, there's no distinction between retiring officials and the promotable officials. Everybody is just prioritizing on the goal of social stability in order to make the record look good when the party's congress is coming. However, normally we do not hypothesize on no distinction. So I put the hypothesis the other way around, meaning this differentiation effect is stronger for non-congress years. So we would observe a stronger distinction when there's no congress years. Another hypothesis would also substantiate my argument is the region effect. So we know that in China, certain regions are really politically sensitive. You can name a lot, like Beijing, right? Like minority-dominated regions like Tibet. So for those regions, I argue that the maintaining social stability rather than achieving growth is their priority goals. So in other words, in those regions, there would be no distinction between retiring officials and promotable officials. Everybody is just prioritizing on the goal of social stability, so the distinction disappears. And similarly, we do not hypothesize on the non-effect, so I put it another way around, saying the distinction or the effect is stronger for non-sensitive regions. Like the regions, for example, in my province, Anhui, well, officials put a lot of efforts on driving GDP growth, and we achieved #1 in the competition. Have a GDP growth rate at like 12 or 13% a year. So this is the first set of hypotheses regarding the government officials' political incentives and how the differential incentives regarding the goal to maintain the goal of social stability and the GDP growth would condition the heterogeneity to what extent the state would approach firms to acquire bankrupted state-owned firms and take over the labor workers. And then another set of hypotheses regarding the interaction between the bureaucracy and enterprises. So I argue that officials' tenure would also play a role here. So when a government official is serving the current position longer, then the familiarity with the local regions would increase, and they would become more embedded in the local community. So they are more legitimized to mobilize local resources to help them achieve such goals. So they would also build solidarity between the government and the business sectors, and also there is potential corruption as well. So I'm arguing here there is an positive interaction effect between the number of labor workers and the officials' longer tenure. And under such effect, the firms would enter new industries as a result of observing the number of laid off workers.
So you mean tenure in their current position,
In
or
their
you
current
mean tenure in this region?
Tenure in this region, yeah.
How long they've been working in
Exactly.
this location?
Yeah. So the average tenure for the officials in my data set is only 3.5 years. It's not a long period. So the last one regarding what kind of firms are more likely to be approached by the officials. I think that helps. This hypothesis helps answer your concern on whether it is an efficiency story. So we observed that those politically co-opted enterprises are more likely to respond to this kind of government officials' request. So state political scientists tell us that the state can co-opt certain business actors in order to enhance the regime's legitimacy. And in the Chinese context, businessmen are doing so by becoming a delegate in the People's Congress or the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conferences. So by becoming the delegates, they really get lots of advantage and benefits by interacting with the governments. So they attend the government meeting more often and regularly. They learn about the government officials' concerns. They learn about the news earlier. And more importantly, they feel stronger obligation to return the favor back to the government. So when the government official has a request, those kind of politically co-opted firms feel less room to say no. So I interviewed one entrepreneur in my hometown regarding this process. He told me that he started in the industry in garment that was export to the United States, to the Europe. And then later on, he diversified into electronics, which has nothing to do with the government. So I asked him, why are you doing that? You do not have any expertise and skills. He said, oh, that was easy. In 2002, the government officials came to me and saying, hey, could you please help me to acquire those laid-off workers? And I said, why not? Because I would like the lands from the government that occupied by the state-owned firms. So it's a win-win situation, and that of course he's a delegate in my hometown. So that's clearly illustrates the process going on here. So when there is increasing number of laid-off workers, and there is also politically co-opted private firms, those private firms are more likely to enter new industries as a result of absorbing laid-off workers. So my data, I have two sets of data. So first, my main independent variables come from the background of government officials. And my unit analysis at the provincial is at the provincial level. So I manually collected CVs of all provincial leaders who served as party secretary and provincial governor during the year time span from 2001 to 2008, and across all 31 provinces. And also I coded the provincial level data from other statistic yearbooks. And then finally, I matched all this provincial level data with all publicly listed firms from the database. So finally, the unit of analysis is at the firm level, and I matched the provincial level to the headquarters of the firm, where the firm is located. So finally, it yielded me over 7,000 observations. Time year is panel data is time year observation. So some famous data points. All the 7 important figures in political bureau except Liu Yingshan, so who all previously served as any head or party secretary in all the provinces, they enter my data point. And also I have Bo Xilai as my data point. I have another variable called corruption, which measures their how did they end up from current positions. And now the data point code as 1 is hugely increased because of the anti-corruption campaign. So the independent variables, I coded the number of laid-off workers and I logged them in the provincial level from 2001 to 2008. And unfortunately, starting from 2010, the government stopped publishing such data. I think there are 2 reasons. One reason is they think the state-owned firms reform has been over, so they never announced number of laid-off workers. The second one is still the concerns regarding social stability. The concern for women is hugely increased in recent years, so they stopped publishing such figure. So my most important independent variable called retiring leaders. So I coded it as 1 if the provincial leader can serve less than 2 full terms in a given year and 0 otherwise. So all the provincial levels, they are required to retire at the age of 65. So I manually counted how many terms or how many parties congress that they can pass before they reach the age of 65. So on average, the average age for retiring leaders in my data set is 59, and the average age for promotable leaders is 51. So you see the age differences. And the Congress years, or my moderating variables, it is coded 1 because in my time span, remember my data spans 2001 to 2008. So there are 2 Congress years in 2002 and 2007, right? So I counted year 2001, 2002, 2006, and 2007 as Congress years because I think 1 year before the Congress year, 2001, 2006, preparing for the party's Congress is also important for the government officials. So I counted them as Congress years as well. And the sensitive regions, politically sensitive regions, I coded the 5 minority-dominated provinces and also plus Beijing. Probably now I think I should include Hong Kong as well as a politically sensitive region, but we don't have laid-off workers here. So tenure is years. Oh, sorry, I corrected the answer I gave to you. So it's year passed since the leader started the current position rather than the current region. The current position. So it's like when a person moves from the governor to the party secretary, it counted as a separate person. Following literatures, they are also doing that. Political co-option coded as 1 if the chairman or CEO of the private firm serves as a delegate at the People's Congress or political consultative conferences. So the political co-option, or the existing literature suggests that this political co-option has much stronger effect for private firms. So that's why I only focus on private firms. Because for state-owned firms, they are just naturally getting the position, and it's not important for them to get additional benefits or additional obligation. So dependent variable here is number of new industries for the firm entering in year T+3, based on the 2-digit of SSE code, the standard American classification for industries. So why I use the time window T+3 for several reasons. First, it takes years to do industry restructuring, and it takes almost 3 years to see the effect happening. And also the laid-off workers stay on the payroll of the bankrupt firms and receive allowances from the government for 3 years. So it gives 3 years for the government to search for the next takeover, for the acquirer from that region. So sometimes they failed, sometimes they succeeded. And if you search newspapers, there are lots of discussions and negotiations reported for this kind of negotiation process going on in the last decade.
May I just
Yeah.
something? Like when the laid-off workers hired from another companies, the receiving allowance is just stopping, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
After they are acquired by another company, they stop receiving any allowance from the government. The government only gave allowance for 3 years before it has been acquired by any other companies. So I think for Chinese, but probably you are too young. I remember when I was at the high school, the state has a lot of campaigns saying restart the life again for laid-off workers. And the government, those programs, the huge programs, just failed for laid-off workers because it cost another huge budget for the government to retrain the laid-off workers, to find new jobs for them. Most of the government officials realize that it's still more efficient to ask firms to acquire bankrupt firms rather than find jobs for individual laid-off workers. So this is also another background information for the story.
But I'm a little bit confused. I mean, a lot of your strategy has to do with the timing of when the congresses occur, at least part of the results. So how do we think about that compared to T+3? Does that mean you're saying if it's a year right before a Congress, you're going to enter a new industry 3 years later?
That's the average. That's the average effect. So the Congress years is plus, and it's another empirical strategy. I'm modeling the three-way interactions between laid-off workers and retiring government officials and the dummy variables. So it means if this year is Congress year, then 3 years later, the effect is more pronounced.
Then 2 years or 1 year later?
Mm-hmm. I'm not comparing 2 years or 1 year. It's just the dependent variable is lagged for 3 years. So I'm observing 2013's diversification as a result of 2000.
Okay, so it's all cross-sectional, the variation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not the longitudinal comparison. I don't think we can do the longitudinal comparison. So firms diversify for lots of reasons, and it's a well-established literature in business schools, in strategy department. So I have to control all these economic explanations or market efficiency explanations in order to get rid out of the other explanations. So at the provincial level, because I control for GDP growth rate of each region, I control for the marketization index for each region, and also for a strict measurement, I control for provincial fixed data. So I control for every province dummy variables in order to get the fixed effect out of province. And at the firm level, I control for industry dummies, the current industries, number of industries that they are operating, the firm age, firm size, return on sales, and whether it is state-owned firms or not, the advertising intensity, technology, R&D, whether CEO holds shares. All those are indicators for explanations that can account for diversification. So for example, in business school, they think firms normally they diversify, not for the sake of profitability, but for the sake of CEO's egoism, to look their empire, to build empire. So we have to control for whether CEOs are the shareholders for the company. And also the advertising intensity and the technology controls for the explanations that the company just good, just purely good, so they can do whatever good in any industries, right? So this is count for the efficiency explanation. And also there are institutional explanations for firms' diversification. For example, CEO's functional backgrounds. Research find that if the CEO used to be a finance officer, it's more likely to do the financial diversification due to the financial gain. And the average of industries entered for the main industry of the focal firm controls for the mimetic pressure from the industry. That firms probably they don't know what they are doing; they just follow others. And also control for FDI and also control for year dummies. So there is a trend of diversification increasing among Chinese years because of the good years of financial stock in 2007 and 2006. So I have to control for the year trend. Okay, so it's a panel data, and the number of industries entered is a Poisson, it's a count variable. So I use random Poisson model with province industry year fixed effect. So it's I think it's a stringent model to test my hypothesis. The most stringent one is control for firm fixed effect. However, some of my variables are time invariant for firms data, such as politically, it's changing but not changing that much. For example, the political, whether they are a delegate as a People's Congress. So I run another robustness check with firm fixed effect, and the results do not change much. So the results, remember H1, I'm arguing that if there is a retiring government officials, and I measure both party secretary and the governor. So the results shows that the interaction between retiring government officials and later workers has positively significant effect on the number of industries that firms enter in T+3 years later on. And it's interesting that the effect is stronger for governor, not for party secretary, and the results remain consistent following the hypothesis. And I consult several political scientists to make sense of this story, and I think they told me that because the governor is really the guy who is in charge of the economic issue, while party secretary is more responsible for the party doctrine or kind of ideological stuff. That's why the effect on governor is stronger. So my H2 regarding the Congress years, the differences between Congress years versus non-Congress years. So econometrically speaking, interpreting a three-way interactions is really difficult. So I just split the samples among Congress years and non-Congress years, and I empirically or statistically compare the coefficient on the interaction coefficient. So it's similarly in non-Congress years, when we have a retiring governor, so the retiring governor are more likely to push firms to acquire bankrupted state-owned firms. And the comparison between non-Congress years versus Congress years is statistically significant. And similarly, I split the sample between regions, sensitive regions and non-sensitive regions, and I also compare the two. Two samples. It's interesting to see that in sensitive regions, such as Beijing or Tibet, it is those promotable officials are more concerning over social stability goals. So thus, we compare the two coefficients, and the coefficient is statistically distinction. So that's why I support my hypothesis that that in non-sensitive regions, retiring governors is prioritizing on the goal of social stability more than GDP growth. So H3 and H4, I'm hypothesizing on tenure effect and also politically co-opted private firms. So it's also gets supported with the governor's tenure, and my last hypothesis on co-opted private firms is also supported. So recap a little bit. So what I'm trying to do in this project is when government officials concerned over the goal of social stability, and there is a problem called laid off workers, the local government officials would like to address the problems of laid off workers. What they are trying to do is to push other local firms to acquire the bankrupt firms and to take over all the laid off workers. And this story is more likely to happen when the region has a retiring government official, because they are more prioritizing on the goal of social stability for their retirement sake. And I observed that the effect is stronger in non-Congress years and in non-politically sensitive regions, because to put it the other way around, that is, the Congress years and the sensitive regions, every official is concerned over political stability. And so that's why we do not observe any distinction between different types of government officials. And official tenure has also a positive effect in mobilizing the business actors, and politically co-opted private firms are more aligned with the state's social goal on social stability. So also another recap on the bigger picture where I come from. So what I'm trying to do in this study is to bring the insights of political sociology and political science on studying the role of the state, also on studying the role of the bureaucracy, starting from the barbarian tradition to the research of strategy, which has always primarily examined firm's strategy or firm performance through an economic perspective on efficiency or market concern. So I would like to study how the structure or the political environments of the government would also have an impact on firms' economic decision. So I'm not saying this is the most important decision. I'm just saying I would like to highlight another possible explanation for firms' economic decision. So I provide a new mechanism to state-firm interactions by highlighting the incentives of government officials. So I also run a bunch of robustness check for economists normally. Right. When I do the presentation.
Maybe you can wrap it up.
Yeah. So I think I pretty much finished.
Oh.
Yeah, pretty much finished. So that's only a couple of robustness check. I also
actually, I was interested in this one actually.
Yeah.
So the results are. What's the conclusion here, that the results are similar? With
pretty much similar, except the last one, politically connected private firms. We lose significance here if you use T+2. So which means probably the restructure hasn't been finished and we do not observe the effect. But the other two, the retiring governor and the tenure, the effect is still there. But if I run T+1, no effect. T+1 is just too soon to observe all the industry restructure. And also I run another independent robustness check on previously the retiring official is measured through a diameter 1 or 0. So now I measure them as the age of the officials. And the result is also similar, but not as strong as the political terms, because age cannot capture so for example, if the two officials get on the position at the same year, but with different age, then the effect would be different. I also run the most stringent model on firm fixed effect. So I still have the other variables, still have other effects, but I lost significance for the last one because most of the variable is not changing by years. That's why I do not have enough variation for this variable. So yeah, I think that's pretty much the presentation. And so any questions? Yeah, please.
You highlight the government officials in their early period of their career. They, like the young government officials, they seek for reward and they prioritize GDP growth rather than social stability.
Yeah.
And in order to boost the GDP growth, you need to bring new investments, new projects. So
Yes.
it will directly reduce the number of late workers as well, right?
Yeah, yeah.
On top, beside laid off workers, is there any other effect, in terms of social increase, the social stability sense, other than laid off workers?
Yeah, of course.
I
Yeah.
just want to ask that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I encountered that questions a lot, especially when economists are sitting in the room. So, but good for you to have the economic sense. So regarding the first question, yes, when the concern is whether taking off laid off workers is also a way for boosting economic growth. I'd say in some certain mechanism or in certain occasions, probably yes. For example, you can create entrepreneurial firms to employ laid off workers, right? But the concern here is the laid off workers, in the eyes of government officials, they are regarded as a political problem rather than an economic problem. So they want to get rid of laid off workers in order to maintain social stability rather than to achieve GDP growth. So probably sometimes they can, but they think it may take a long time for entrepreneurial firms to grow, right? It takes a long time for training those laid off workers. Remember, there are laid off workers from state-owned firms. They get bankrupted because they are unskilled, right? So for them it's difficult to make them to boost the economic growth. But it is the social or political problem that is the most urgent at hand. That's why they, when the social priority, when they prioritize on social problems. So when the young officials would like to do GDP growth, they are more likely to resort to attract foreign FDI to attract central-owned enterprises rather than find a way to employ them.
So it will take more time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they are unskilled.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So your second question is.
Other than laid off workers in terms of social.
Yeah. There are a lot.
Yeah.
So I have another junior who is working similar in my stuff. So his measurement on social stability is by the 上访, how to translate it in English? Petition. So his finding is when there are lots of petition in certain region, then the firms are less likely to diversify into real estate industry. So the mechanism is also similar, but requires a little bit explanation. I do not remember for now. So there are a lot of other issues that could create problems for social stability. Petition, what else? Petition is definitely the most important one here. Yeah.
I was thinking maybe in terms of social stability, it's more the project is more environmental friendly and besides reducing the laid off workers, they are more concerning about the environmental friendly projects and the aging population, social structure, the inequality of society. I was thinking that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So you are saying probably when there is a project explosion or like what we had yesterday, that also creates social stability. Yeah, I think so. There are qualitative evidence, but it would be difficult to do quantitative data analysis. Yeah, the data is not complete, and the officials do not want to publicize those data.
Thank you.
So, others? Yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So you propose social stability as a main political incentive for retiring officials to doing this. While I wonder, actually, probably is it possible there is another incentive from the firm's perspective, which is if you find someone who is retiring who has no potential to go even further, so probably that means this one will take in charge, stay on the position in the local area for a long time, which makes you to like care more about
Yeah.
his suggestions.
Yeah.
And then if they want to maintain a good
Yeah.
relationship with the leader,
Yeah.
of course they will
Yeah.
take more, care more
Yeah.
as
Yeah,
requested.
definitely, definitely. I think that that's definitely something could be going on here, and that is a process. So you are talking about the interaction among the officials, their arrangement, political arrangement, right? We make a division of labor. Then you you are young and promotable. You are in charge of GDP growth. I'm retiring, so I'm in charge of social stability. That definitely could be working. However, I think that's beyond the scope of this study, and I'm unable to. From this paper, I'm unable to answer that question, to disentangle those mechanisms, but definitely that's true. I think I wrote some of the part in the discussion, and I think that is left to the political scientists to find out.
Right. I mean, even for the same leader, because we know he's retiring and he's going to stay here probably,
Mhm.
so the firm may receive his message and trying to acquire more,
Mhm.
because we know this person will also take charge for another 10 years or 5 years. So yeah, I agree.
Any other questions? Okay, so why don't we close here? We're beyond